Welcome to the On the Horizon podcast, Buying and Selling Businesses, brought to you by Horizon Business Brokers, your trusted guide to buying, selling, and valuing businesses. Your next opportunity is just on the horizon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to On the Horizon. Jeremy Wolf here, alongside the man, the myth, legend, Dustin Zaire. Dustin, always good to see you, brother.
Great to see you, Jeremy, and thanks for joining us today.
Yes. So, Dustin, as business owners, we pour countless hours of our lives into our business, blood, sweat, and tears. And when we arrive at that place where it's time to sell our business, often our judgment can be clouded. Many times we have unrealistic valuations floating around our head about what our business is worth and unrealistic expectations. So today we're going to talk a little bit about most common deal killers, right? Things that kind of go wrong that derail business sales. And we're going to start right there with unrealistic valuations and expectations. As a business owner, I might think my business is worth one thing, but in reality, it's not in alignment. Has that been your experience with many sellers?
Yeah, from all the sellers that we talked to, I can't necessarily say that a vast majority of them have had a valuation that was in line with market. They were misinformed or misguided by friends, family, maybe another advisor, whether that was an accountant or an attorney. So there's a rare occasions that they got the right information or have reasonable expectations. So it's our job to help them understand how a business like theirs is valued and how a buyer will perceive the value and what the most probable sale price is going to be.
So how do you typically deal with that? You come in and the business owner does have these inflated numbers in their mind. What are some of the benchmarks or methods that you use in your process to help really educate sellers to understand the valuation process so that they could come back to reality?
Yeah, first and foremost, it's learning about their business, right? What industry are they in? How their business is structured, what their day-to-day involvement is, how many employees they may have. Are there any key customers that make up more than 10 or 20% of the revenue? These things are going to have an impact on the overall value, in addition to, again, size, revenue performance, cash flow performance. But getting an understanding of these things to be able to look at our reference guides and comp databases that we can pull up on screen, share with our sellers and say, hey, your lawn care and landscape business, for example, it's this NACE code, and that's the operational code that is on your on the business tax return. So you look at their industry, make sure that their NACE code on their tax return matches to their industry. Sometimes it doesn't. So then you have to find the best NACE code that does. And then we can pull up these comps and reference guides to say, hey, your lawn care and landscape business under this NACE code is trading for whatever it is, 2.5, 3 times cash flow. Maybe it's 3, 4 times cash flow if it's doing over $1 million in revenue. So we can show them the industry. And then if it's doing less than $1 million in revenue, it typically has these valuation practices. If it's doing $1 million to $2.5 million, it's this revenue, it's this multiple, right? Or if it's doing over 10 million, it's this typical multiple. So we can share that live data with them and then break down the numbers with them, looking at what their cash flow is, determining that from reviewing their P&Ls and balance sheets and tax returns and saying, okay, look, Mr. Seller, your lawn care landscape company is generating $1 million in revenue and it's cash flowing you $200,000. And this reference guide is suggesting that the value is 2.5 times that number. So your value is $500,000 approximately. And then, they might ask questions. Does that include my equipment, all the trucks and trailers and mowers and blowers that I have? And the answer is yes, right? All the equipment and all the furnitures and fixtures that you use to operate that business on a day-to-day to generate that $1 million in revenue and cash flow performance is what needs to be included in the sale of the business. It's all included in that valuation multiple, right?
It's all part of the equation,
Yes.
as they say. Do you find that a lot of business owners are coming in when you first meet them with a number in their mind where they know they do generate X amount of revenue and they know the formula loosely? So they're like, hey, Dustin, I think my business is worth 2.5 million. That's what I want to list it at. Or are you oftentimes kind of arriving at that number with them through this discovery process? Because I can see how it could be a little bit awkward if your first encounter with them is, yeah, it's worth 2.5 million. And then you have to go through this process to pull them down and pull them back and help educate them. And I could see how people could get almost offended, right? Because they put so much time into this. And if their number doesn't match up with what they're looking for, I could see how that could turn them off from a deal. No?
Yeah. So we don't take engagements or listings from business owners or sellers that are, I emphatically want $2.5 million for my business, right? We have to go through a process to confirm that their business is worth $2.5 million and saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, what if it's only worth $1.5 million? You don't want to come to market at $2.5 million and be overpriced and never sell if you really want to sell your business. Oh, if we don't go through the valuation process and figure out what the true value is, maybe it was worth $5 million. Right? You don't want to leave money on the table. So we do bring them through a full, complete business valuation to set the pricing expectations to make sure that they're going to get the number that they desire, right? If it's obtainable. And if it's not obtainable, then help them, give them some pointers to say, okay, if you want X dollars and it's only worth this right now, then you need to increase your revenues or increase your margins, build your cash flow to be able to get to that value later.
Ever had a seller walk away from a deal because they were chasing a number?
Yes, it's happened. It's only happened a couple of times where we actually had a seller back out of a transaction. It wasn't because the expectations weren't set correctly or that they didn't get their number. The one deal that came to mind, which was many years ago, was a property management company. And the deal was like 500,000 or maybe it was 550 actually. They got full asking price. The buyer was going through SBA financing, quit his job. We were about to close. And just a couple of days before, the seller said, I'm not going through with it. And we asked why. You got your number. "Oh, this just isn't the deal that we agreed to." I'm like, it's every bit of the deal that we agreed to. It just turned out that they just really weren't ready to sell yet. And maybe they thought their business was worth a little bit more money. Maybe. I don't know. We ended up parting ways after that deal fell apart. So I don't know exactly what happened after that. Another instance was actually a lawn care company, believe it or not. They just also weren't ready to sell. We set the expectations of what it was likely going to be worth, depending on who the buyer was. We got a very strong offer. It was something like $5.5 or $6 million for this business. And the seller declined and later went back to me and to the buyer and said, I'm sorry, I just wasn't ready. You actually made a great offer. It's exactly what I would have offered for my own business, right? So I think it's timing more than anything. And we try to make sure that all the stars align, right? Like timing, the economics behind best value, closing for best tax liability, structure for best tax liability. Sometimes just things don't work out.
Yeah, there's going to be certain circumstances that fit that category for sure. But a lot of it comes back to what you talked about with doing the due diligence from the beginning, managing expectations and going through that process to help educate sellers so that when you arrive at the number and you go to sell, they're ready for that. Another big killer is for financial documentation. What does clean books actually mean from a buyer's perspective?
Great question. So clean books from a buyer's perspective and a lender's perspective is revenue, whether it's cash received or whether it's checks, merchant processing from the various merchant processors, like making sure all revenue captured on your tax return. So all revenue is deposited into your bank accounts, specifically the cash, right? Sometimes that doesn't make it in there, but in order to have good, clean, solid books, you want to see all your revenues, all of your expenses, right? Sometimes there's businesses that have cash labor, because maybe there's undocumented employees. Unfortunately, that's another topic. So you want to make sure that any expense going out, whether that's cash or not, is included on your financials. So a buyer gets a clear picture as to how the business is operating. I can give for example, on a deal that we actually just closed yesterday, and it was a dry cleaner, and there was something like $50,000 to $60,000 a year in cash that was coming in, but wasn't getting deposited to the bank. And part of that $50,000 to $60,000 was being used to pay employees, kind of cash under the table for whatever reasons there may have been. And then when the buyer was doing their due diligence and trying to confirm the revenues and expenses and looking at the P&Ls and the tax returns and the bank statements and trying to reconcile all of them, they discovered that there was an additional expense for the purchase of a new broiler in the plant, which was like a $30,000 expense.
A new
And
broiler?
we're like, where's it documented? A new broiler. So it's basically the heater of the dry.
Okay, got it. Okay.
The dry cleaning plant. So this broiler is like $30,000. And it wasn't an expense on the profit and loss statement. It wasn't an expense on the tax return because the broiler was paid in cash. Like when they bought the broiler, they paid cash for it because they had cash sitting in their safe or under their mattress or wherever it was, right?
Mm.
These are things that you don't want to do. Like the buyer wants to be able to verify all income and expenses. And if they can't, and they know things are happening, they're going to make their own assumptions. And those assumptions may not be true and accurate to how the business is really financially operating, right?
So let me ask you a question about that. So if you have a business that maybe that is their practice, just like you mentioned on this particular deal, is there ever a scenario where you go through this process with them and you say, hey, look, like it might not make the most sense to proceed with selling the business now. Maybe we want to hold off for some period of time where you get the books. There's no way to backtrack, right? You can't go into the books or what do you recommend? Like, what do you say to a seller that's in that position, right? Where they haven't been managing their books properly? Is that something that will always take some manner of time to fix, or is there a way to fix it in the moment? How does that typically work?
Yeah, good question. So it depends on what they're doing, like with their books, right? So on the cash side of things, yeah, you don't really want to go back and amend your tax returns for the past 3 years because that would raise a red flag with the IRS, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you would want to implement a strategy to say, all right, if you want to be able to get the extra value from your business, from the cash that's coming in from your operations that you're just not depositing, then you're probably going to want to run your business for at least another 1 to 3 years and have all your deposits and have all of your expenses on your P&Ls and your balance sheets and your tax return. Now, there may be situations or circumstances where I would say probably on the smaller deals or maybe on the deals that aren't reliant on bank funding, right? Where there's going to be more scrutiny with bank financing. So if there's a cash buyer, you may be able to reorganize your books from the previous years and be able to demonstrate those to the buyer to say, hey, you can't do it with the cash necessarily. That definitely you need to give yourself time. Like I said, give yourself another 1 to 3 years to get all that cash circulating through the bank and through your financials. But there's other things that may happen in your P&L that you can basically recast the P&L for the buyer and say, hey, we put our insurance payments into our rent expense. It shouldn't be there, but that's what we're doing. And I can show you a recasted P&L without having my mortgage payment in the rent expense. And so they can see what the financial picture looks like without that or whatever other discretionary, silly spending they may be doing and wherever they may be classifying that. So you can't go back and recreate in that circumstance.
Yeah, it can be this is why it's so important. I know we talked about this before. When you start a business, like I'm speaking now to anybody out there that's just starting or looking to buy or start a business, to set these things in place and do things properly from the inception of the business. We are creatures of habit. And when we get set in poor habits with the business and you go for years and years, it could be incredibly difficult to unwind all that. And it just starts with doing things properly from the beginning. So that's a big component to it.
Agreed. Start good habits from the beginning, and then you won't have to spend time fixing your mistakes later.
In life and in business, Dustin.
100%.
What about confidentiality, right? Failing to manage confidentiality. Is that something that comes into play? What are some of the biggest risks with letting the word leak that the business is for sale?
Yeah. So confidentiality is the number one important thing in trying to sell your business and then representing a business for sale, right? Like you don't want your employees or your vendors or your clients knowing that your business is for sale, right? It can be very detrimental, right? Even though most employees actually keep their jobs, I would say in my 20 years of experience and the 400 plus transactions that we've done, I've never heard of any sell or buyer coming in and
Just clean the
laying
house.
off these folks.
Yeah.
You might see that in your larger M&A transactions when you have two similar sized companies and your C-suite. You don't need two C-suite. They merge and maybe half of the C-suite gets eliminated. In your typical small Main Street business, those employees maintain those key relationships with customers. They know the day-to-day policies and procedures of the business. Like the buyers are buying them just as much as they're buying the business, right? Like they are the business. They're part of the business. So they really have job security. But if an employee finds out that their owner, the business owner, is selling the business, they get scared. It's like that fight or flight mode.
Yep.
And they could tell other employees, they could tell their customers, and then the business starts to unravel just because they really didn't know the full picture. So the best advice that we give and when talking to our sellers is don't tell the employees. They don't need to know until the transaction is closed. And buyers can generally understand and appreciate that because they want to make sure that those employees are there. They're not scared off. And then again, the vendors, your clients, you don't want them knowing that the business is going to be sold. Like they're again, fight or flight mode. Am I going to get the same level of service? Are the prices going to go up? I better start looking for another place to do business with. So
especially if you have clients that have long-term relationships with the owner of the business.
Exactly. That's something that you want to protect and you want to make sure that you transition properly. That's part of the sale. And there's a training and transitional program, right? The sellers typically provide to the buyers. You could be anywhere from 30 to 90 days. And part of that time is introducing them to the clients that they may have personal relationships with.
Yeah.
Not personal, but
then I got to think if you have a long-standing relationship with a client as the owner, you would have a relationship with them such that conversation would come a little bit more naturally. And once you have everything organized and set to go, you could seamlessly kind of transition into that. Like what you don't want is, again, like we alluded to, having that leaked out and then finding out through another source, because that completely eviscerates all confidence in your relationship.
exactly.
You have to be upfront about it, but you have to do it in a way that makes sense for both parties.
Yeah. And typically that's not done until the transaction is closed either. The intent, and if there's concerns of a major client leaving, there's probably a provision in your purchase agreement. Maybe there's a seller note, maybe there's an earnout, maybe there's a holdback tied to the retention of this large client. But generally speaking, clients and vendors and employees are not informed of the sale until the transaction is closed. And then over that transitional training and support period, that seller is spending time with the buyer to have a very smooth handoff to maintain all of those relationships.
Now, have you ever had a scenario where the information got leaked too soon and you had to do damage control? And if so, what was that process like?
Thankfully, in 20 years, I have not had that happen.
That speaks to your unbelievable prowess and professionalism as a business pro.
I would like to think so. Yeah, so we haven't had any issues, thankfully. I take that back. There was one instance, I'm sorry, one instance It was not that they were directly told. It was really more so of a savvy buyer putting the pieces to the puzzle together. They saw a business marketed for sale. Name and location certainly wasn't disclosed, but they just so happened to be a customer of this business. It was a children's of party and entertainment business in Loudoun County in Northern Virginia, where we do most of where we're based. And a buyer, I guess, went in to the business and talked to the manager, who was was related to the owner, brother-in-law, I forget. And
Blindsided.
yeah, and was the buyer was like, "Hey, I saw your business for sale, and I do prep our sellers. If this does ever happen, then you might want to have a valid reason, or you can shrug it off and say something like, everything is for sale at the right price.
Nah,
Or do you expect me to do this forever? I got some feelers out there, but don't worry, I'm
his
just
job is
protected,
secure. Yeah.
right?
All right. So
So
yeah.
that's the only time that we've ever had anything happen in 20 years. And it was very isolated. And it's just, sometimes you have those people that are just really smart and they take a good educated guess and they got it right, but they handled it well.
Glad to hear. Want to segue into something we alluded to earlier, which was the due diligence of a deal, right? Understanding due diligence. What should sellers expect? Besides the P&L, what documents or info do savvy buyers really scrutinize in these deals?
It just could vary from business to business, industry to industry, depending on if you're retail, B2C, if it's B2B, if you have contracts. So I guess we'll hit on some broad items. So P&Ls, balance sheets, tax returns, obviously. Bank statements to tie in. They're going to want to see merchant reports to also tie in. So if you're doing your merchant reports are going to be your credit card processing, right? They're going to want to see your payroll reports, right? They're going to make sure that the payroll that they're seeing on the P&Ls and balance sheets and tax returns match to the 941s, match to the W-2s, right? They're going to want to see your contracts, right? So if you are a B2B or even B2C and you have contracts with your clients, they're going to want to validate contracts, right? If they're forward facing contract, right? So for a government contractor, you might have a contract with one of the government agencies for 3-5 years or whatever the case may be. So they're going to want to see that contract. If you are a home improvement contractor and you're selling your work in progress or your future work, essentially, or at least a version thereof based on past performance, but they want to make sure that you have a backlog of work that's going to support continued performance. They're going to verify and validate the contracts that you have signed with your clients for work that's going to be done in the future. Your vendor agreements, if you're getting materials and supplies from whatever vendor, wholesaler, distributor, making sure that there's an active agreement in place, especially if you have set pricing, right? As we see with the tariffs, inflation, that's very important. So as you are working with if you're working to purchase a business that imports their materials or their cost of goods, you want to see how the tariffs are potentially going to impact that. Because if you're going to be paying more in tariffs, then you either have to increase your prices to your audience, to your client, your consumer, or you're going to be eating that additional cost. Your profit, your cash flow is going to be lower. Trying to think, obviously your lease, right? If you have a lease, the buyer is going to review that during their due diligence period to make sure that they have a secure lease term, that there's no crazy escalations, that they have the right to operate at that business, at that location for an extended period of time. Generally speaking, a buyer is going to want to have a lease for a total of 10 years. I say minimally, especially if they're using an SBA loan, right? Because an SBA loan is typically a 10-year term. And one of the requirements for an SBA loan is that the lease term has to coincide with the loan term. So you're going to need a total of 10 years. So they're going to want to look at the lease. If you have any employment contracts with your employees, you're going to want to see that as well, or any other independent contractor relationships that you may have, right?
Yeah.
We just sold a painting company and the buyer wanted to see the independent contractor agreements that the business had with the subs that they used, right? To make sure that it's a valid relationship and they're going to continue to maintain same pricing.
Now,
Can't really,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can't really think of anything else, but then one other thing popped into my mind was licenses, right? So if you, especially if you have a specialty trade business, right? Yeah, plumbing, HVAC, electrical, maybe you have your plumber's license, your electrician's license. Like these are licenses that actually don't convey with the sale. Like usually those licenses are tied to an individual. So you need to make sure that the buyer has a full understanding of that. Can they operate the business from day one without a license themselves, or do they need to maintain the seller as an employee to be able to use their license, or they need to hire an employee that has the license? So if there's licenses that are needed to operate the business, those need to they need to get straightened out. The buyer needs to be able to obtain those licenses from the proper jurisdiction.
Lots of moving parts. That's why it's so important to have professionals such as yourself involved with this process. Now, during this due diligence phase where you're gathering all these things and getting everything together, are you typically recommending involving a CPA or attorney at that point? Or does that come in after you have this all together to go over with a fine-tooth comb, go over the details?
Yeah. So we make the recommendation at the very beginning when working with the sellers. You need to make sure that you have proper legal counsel, that you have a good CPA and bookkeeper to be able to make sure your financials are up to date, run the reports that are going to be requested if you're not doing them in-house yourself, obviously. And then for the buyer, yes, as they enter into their due diligence period, really executing the LOI and entering into the due diligence period, do they have counsel and outside advisory support, right, to help them do their proper due diligence? The attorney is going to obviously negotiate the legal docs, but they're also going to draft and negotiate the legal docs on the buyer's end. But they're also going to research the entity that's being purchased to make sure that it's in good standing with the IRS, to make sure it's in good standing with the state, that there's no taxes that are due. And sometimes you find that the business isn't in good standing with the state, but it's not because they didn't pay their taxes, it's just because they forgot to send in their $50 or $100 annual reinstatement fee with the state. That's the other thing to look for. But yes, we are encouraging and advising from the beginning stages that both sides need to have outside legal and financial support to get them through due diligence.
What are some of the bigger red flags that usually, when it comes to the due diligence period, that usually tend to kill a deal outright?
The biggest red flags that tend to kill a deal outright: the unreported, undocumented revenues and expenses can certainly create an immediate level of distrust. Not having your no, the big one also here recently is employee status, right? If you have employees that may not be legal citizens, right? That is a huge issue that a lot of buyers don't get past, especially in your larger transactions, your private equity groups that are buying businesses and your large institutional buyers. Like, they have large companies that employ hundreds of people, right? They can't buy a business where you have illegal employees. So you want to make sure that your employees are documented. If you know that your employees are not legal citizens and don't have the correct working papers, you probably want to get rid of them and hire people that are. But you could employ a strategy where you're having them work for you as independent contractors and 1099s. I would suggest those business owners that have illegal employees, maybe they speak with their accountant and their attorney for best strategies on how to rectify that. But that tends to be one of the biggest things. And then not qualifying for licensing. So like, we try to get in front of that, and this should be known at the beginning. Like, I mean, we try to make sure that our buyers are aware. Look, if you're buying a electrical contractor, you need to have a master electrician's license to be able to operate this business, or you need to have a partner, or you need to be willing to buy the business and let the seller maintain some equity so they can continue to hold the license for you, or you would have to employ them so they can continue to hold the license. The same thing with government contractors. You have all these different designations and set aside programs for 8A businesses or for disabled veteran owned small businesses, right? So if the buyer isn't an SDVUSB or isn't on the 8A schedule or isn't a minority, right? If they can't obtain that status of their own, then they can't fulfill those contracts and win the recompetes on those contracts. So that's a big red flag that hopefully, if you have proper counsel, this is something that's put in front of you at the beginning and you're able to get in front of it. But other than that, just misrepresentations is the biggest red flag. So if that comes from your clients, if that comes from the revenue, if that comes from the cash flow that was being represented, but it's not because you're representing, cash that you didn't deposit in the bank, and there's no way for you to verify that legitimately. That's a huge thing. That's all I can really think of as far as red flags.
Yeah. And I think that there's like a balance between being transparent and like oversharing, right? So like question is, how honest is too honest? Obviously, if there's some things that could become issues, you might want to bring those to the forefront early to show kind of good faith and that you're looking out for the overall best interest. But it could be easy to give out too much negative information, like things that you don't want to share necessarily. How do you strike a balance between that? Because obviously there's some things that are definitively going to come out throughout the process, but then there are other things that maybe you don't want to shine a light on, but you don't want to be like, again, you don't want to be hiding anything.
Yeah. As the old adage goes, honesty is the best policy, and being as transparent as possible, because the buyer is likely going to find out during due diligence.
Yeah.
And if they don't find out during due diligence, and God forbid they find out later, then there could be some sort of breach of the purchase agreement and the representations and warranties that were likely in that purchase agreement, that where the seller could be held liable for potential damages or something to that effect. So we tried to get everything out there at the beginning. We may not, I guess, fully share like the complete picture of a situation, just to say, hey, look, let this be known, right? Like, for example, and I'm not trying to be like super discreet here, but for example, like we have a deal right now for a childcare center where the seller has $150,000 of like discretionary spending through American Express. We make a note of that in our advertising materials and sharing. There's discretionary spending through Amex of $150,000 a year to be shared and discoverable during due diligence, right? I don't need to show you every item that made up the $150,000 when I'm sending you our initial package of information. If you are interested in purchasing this business and you make an offer and that offer is acceptable, it would obviously be contingent upon review of financials and confirming that the total cash flow of, we'll call it $500,000, inclusive of that $150,000 of Amex spending, can be verified. And then during due diligence, we will show the buyer all the Amex statements and verify, look, these are all personal expenses. But we don't need to do that at the beginning. We'll spend that time with that buyer when it's necessary.
For sure. It definitely makes sense. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this one up? Did we miss anything?
Jeremy, I think we covered a lot, from getting prepared for due diligence as a seller, going through kind of the due diligence process as a buyer. Yeah, just make sure that you're seeking proper counsel, both on the buy side and sell side, to prepare yourself, to make sure that you have everything ready. And as a buyer, I'm sure you're going to research, and you can get due diligence checklists online. You can Google due diligence checklists, but mind you, like, not those checklists aren't a one size fits all model, right? So you make sure that above all else, like, you you have your certain 5 or 10 things as a buyer that you want to confirm and get those things where reasonably possible, right? And I identified those things on this call. So it's largely financially driven and contracts, right? So if you can get that information and feel comfortable with it yourself or with your due diligence team, you probably have a winning business. And you should complete the transaction as long as you feel like you got fair price and terms. If you didn't and you have some feeling of uncertainty, you ask for whatever information that you feel like you need to be 100% certain and confident. Ask the seller to provide it to you. If they can't, hopefully they have a valid reason as to why. And if they can't and you don't accept their reason as to why, walk away. It's okay.
A red flag, baby.
Yep, it's a red flag. Walk away. There's going to be plenty of other deal.
Plenty of opportunities just on the horizon.
That's right.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thanks as always, everyone, for tuning in. If you found this useful, don't forget the drill. Don't forget to subscribe. If we missed anything, let us know about it in the comments. We're always interested to hear your feedback. So everyone have a great day, and we will catch you all next time on the next episode of On the Horizon.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
All right, take care, everyone.
That wraps up this episode of On the Horizon podcast, Buying and Selling Businesses, brought to you by Horizon Business Brokers. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone ready to take their next step. For more resources and personalized support, visit www.horizonbrokers.com or call 703-910-7384. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time on The Horizon, where buying and selling businesses meets opportunity.